Ukraine is willing to bring the war closer to the ordinary Russian citizens. The projections about the state of Russian economy are not optimistic. It is highly expected that Ukraine will inflict as much damage as possible to Russian critical infrastructure. I think we see a bit of shift when it comes to Ukraine's campaign, and the current drone attacks on targets within Russia demonstrate that Ukraine is willing to bring the war closer to the ordinary Russian citizens, so that ultimately they put pressure on their government to accept and sit at the negotiation table. And I think these kind of attacks are directly challenging Putin's key war narratives, that the war is something that is happening distant from the daily lives of most Russians. And I think these attacks on Wildberries is quite striking because, firstly, it's one of the driving forces behind Russian economy. It is employing around 4 million people, so it will have a significant impact on Russian households. And at the same time, President Zelensky mentioned that Wildberries has been used as a logistics hub for some of the military materials, and that's why Ukraine has decided to target specifically this company, which has been framed as one of the main online retailers within Russia. So I think, first of all, the feeling of insecurity is on the rise within Russia because there is a consistency when it comes to Ukraine's attacks. They have been, especially for the past couple of weeks, consistently attacking targets within Russia, and that has become a significant concern for ordinary Russians. And we see that there is a rising dissatisfaction when it comes to how Russians are feeling about the course of the war. Firstly, because they see and they feel that the economy is deteriorating. The projections about the state of Russian economy are not optimistic. And secondly, because they are increasingly worried about the impact that these attacks may have on their daily lives. And we see that some Russians, through their social media channels, such as Telegram, for instance, are blaming the local governments for not being able to prepare the citizens for these kind of attacks. This is something quite unusual for Russians, and that's why I think Ukraine's strategy has had much impact, because it shifts the narrative within Russia, and I think it's significant in a sense that even though Russians are currently living under growing repressions, still I think the regime cares about managing the public dissatisfaction within various segments of the population. So if we will see that this dissatisfaction may grow in the nearest future, I think this will become a bit of a headache for the Kremlin. I think Ukrainians have a bit of momentum right now to escalate the current efforts when it comes to their long-range attacks. So far, they have been quite successful, and it shows that there are significant gaps on the Russian side repelling these sort of attacks. So they have been largely inefficient with this regards, and I think Ukraine is very wisely using their asymmetric advantage when it comes to the drone warfare. And I think in the coming months, it is highly expected that Ukraine will further boost its potential to inflict as much damage as possible to Russian critical infrastructure, so that they rise the costs of the war. And primarily, the aim of these attacks is to economically damage Russia, but also, as I mentioned, to change public opinion. The number of the population that thinks that the war needs to end as soon as possible. We already see that looking at the public opinion polls, there are a larger portion of people who believe that war needs to end. So far what we are looking at when it comes to a battlefield situation, the summer offensive is still ongoing, but Russia has not been able to seize much momentum and take more ground. But at the same time, Ukraine has also significant gaps and shortages when it comes to their own defense forces. And unfortunately, especially when it comes to the weapon systems, the particular gap that Ukraine has is the anti-ballistic missile defense systems, in which Russia has much more advantage because they do use a lot of ballistic missiles against Ukrainian cities, and countering that has been a significant challenge for Ukraine. At the same time, on the battlefield, Russia is still trying to escalate things in the Donbas region, but so far, I think all the sort of estimates show that Russia is unlikely to be able to achieve its goal, which is seizing the Donbas region. At least in its current pace and with its current resources that are involved on the battlefront, it is unlikely that we will see some sort of massive breakthrough from the Russian side. But at the same time, Ukraine is also quite stretched when it comes to its resources, and unlike Russia, Ukraine is much more dependent on Western support when it comes to the equipment and weapons. Russians have had a number of issues when it comes to equipment, but more importantly, when it comes to recruitment. And I think this remains one of the key challenges because the loss of life when it comes to the battlefield is quite high for Russians. It is estimated from 30 to 34,000 per month, which is a higher number that Russia is able to recruit. So that's one of the key challenges that Russian government is currently facing in terms of any escalation scenarios. They will have to somehow balance these numbers and boost efforts when it comes to recruitment. But we have been looking at the trend that Russians are not very much enthusiastic when it comes to directly being involved into the war efforts. So that's why there are considerable doubts how much political risks any sort of escalation scenarios contain. And I think if Putin has to restore to mass mobilization, for instance, this would be highly political risky move. When it comes to current efforts, we see that the regime is becoming increasingly desperate when it comes to recruiting students. For example, there has been campaigns within the Russian universities to try to engage students into the Russia's war efforts. And so far, I think the ordinary citizens are very reluctant to, even at the expense of economic incentives that the Russian government is offering them, to try and put their lives under the risk of being sent into the battlefield. It's fair to say that the momentum is more on Ukraine's side, and Russia has been reputationally quite damaged in the sense that they are unable to do anything about the successful Ukrainian long-range drone attacks. If Ukraine wants to proceed in its current pace, I think they have a good potential to significantly damage Russian critical infrastructure. And we have already seen that the recent damages have provoked massive fuel shortages, and that has disturbed the daily lives of the local population that has been directly exposed to these attacks. So in that sense, I think Ukraine does have a momentum, but I think the main and I should say decisive factor would be the longevity and continuity in these attacks. We can say that it marks newer chapter, but that said, Ukraine has already tried to use their drone capabilities inside Russia, but now I think their campaign is becoming much more diverse and attacking one of the key Russian retailers, online retailers such as Wildberries. I do think that this is something new and something that we haven't seen before, but I think the message is still the same in terms of making the war extremely costly for Russia and proving that there is still morale and willingness within Ukraine to fight in this war and to repel Russian aggression by inflicting damage on Russia and especially targeting the areas that are critically important for Russian economy. I think it's a very smart strategy from the Ukrainian side because Ukraine is able to use all the advantages that they have. And currently, they have proven to have the asymmetric advantage because they have been able to boost their drone production quite significantly and use these capabilities against Russia. So in that sense, I think it is very wise to plan this campaign the way they have planned, and also to send a significant message to Ukraine's partners, especially the United States, that Ukraine does have cards when it comes to continuing the war and fighting in this war against Russia. And in terms of any future prospects, I think what Ukraine may be looking at is to do as much as possible to disrupt Russian logistics when it comes to supplying Russian army through Crimea, for example. Crimea, of course, is not only logistics hub and important from logistic perspective, but also it has a significant weight to it, as Ukraine is now able to deconstruct all the image that Putin has been creating in terms of this region that has been prosperous, a touristic hub for Russians to go and spend their times there. Now all this image has been significantly damaged, even in the eyes of the Russians, who are unwilling to put their lives under risk. So in that sense, I think it's both the political aims, but also maybe perhaps more significantly the strategic calculations when it comes to targeting critical areas that are essential for Russia from logistics purposes in terms of continuing the war efforts. So Russia is expected to hold State Duma elections. As much as these elections are largely symbolic and they do not really represent any challenge for Putin's regime, I think it's still very important for Putin to manage the public opinion within Russia. I do not certainly think that the current dissatisfaction, even if it grows, will ultimately translate into some sort of mass protest that may directly challenge the longevity of Putin's regime. Unfortunately, there is no opposition right now within Russia that may lead such protests or that may maximize on the rising public dissatisfaction. So therefore, the risks for the regime stability are still quite low, I think. But at the same time, if the state of economy continues to deteriorate, and at the same time the dissatisfaction among the population rises, this may lead Putin to think about the options. And I think when it comes to the options, there aren't many choices that he has. First option would be maybe to sit down at the negotiation table and try to negotiate maybe with some reduced demands. And as we know, in the past, Putin has had very much maximalist demands when it comes to these negotiations. Hence, we have been looking at complete stagnation of this process in the past couple of months. And second option would be the escalation. I think there are still ways in which Putin can escalate his war effort. And I think these calculations will depend not just on public dissatisfaction. I don't really think that this would be the main variable, but how long Russia is economically able to sustain its war effort. And in that sense, I think one of the key factors would be the Ukrainian attempts to damage Russia's war economy even further.